Welcome back to another episode of the Ag Carbon podcast from the Agoro Carbon Alliance. I'm your host, Chris Daley. Today I'm sitting down with two senior agronomists here at Agoro Carbon, Mark and John, and we're chatting about how a carbon project can claim carbon offsets. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce our guests. So Mark, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Mark Warner. I have been an agronomist with Agoro here for almost 4 years now. Prior to my time with Agoro, I spent my years working in the input side of agriculture, was a chem rep with Syngenta for a number of years, and sold seed corn for a couple of the AgriLiant genetics brands. So spent the beginning of my career working more so in that realm, and did not grow up on a farm myself. My family sold out in the 80s and early 90s, and during my kind of beginning of my career, I just kind of became intrigued with the no-till movement or groups, cover crops, the regenerative ag movement in those years, and just somewhat saw a difference on a lot of those farms, a difference in their ability to kind of utilize water better, be more efficient in their operations, things of that nature, and was fortunate to start farming with my in-laws in 2018 and begin a farm basically from absolute nothing with them in that year, and grow it utilizing the practices that we promote in our carbon program. So when this opportunity came about, I really didn't know a whole lot about the carbon side of our business. I understood the agronomics of what we were going to be promoting, but knew next to nothing essentially of the carbon markets and what we would be doing. So it's been a really fascinating journey for me, as we talk about verification here today, of just what all goes into generating what we are working to generate, and how the agronomy that I understood coming into this role plays a part in that. So it's been quite a journey and quite a learning experience for myself.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Mark. I'm really looking forward to picking your brain a little bit on some of the practices you mentioned there a bit earlier, as well as you mentioned a bit about water and water retention, and we'll definitely get back to that. But before that, John, can we hear a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm John Pullis. I'm senior agronomist and soil sampling lead for Agoro Carbon. Much like Mark, been here for about 4 years, almost since the very beginning of the company. And prior to that, I was working for an independent ag retailer here in Michigan for about 10 years, doing a lot of precision ag and sales work. And so that retailer started to get involved in some sustainability projects with different companies. And so it kind of got my first taste into what some of those sustainability and regenerative ag practices look like, and how they impacted farmers and impacted the final product that was being sold, and the chain along the way. So really got interested in that. I have a master's degree in soil science. That's kind of the basis of a lot of my knowledge or my understanding in agriculture. Much or similar to Mark, I didn't grow up on a farm, but I've always kind of been interested in farming and I'd say tangential to farming. So that's really, it's always been a part of, or a passion of what I like to do and what I like to learn about. And so again, like Mark said, there's a lot of knowledge or learning curve along the way. There's a lot of aspects of this industry and the verification process specifically that we use the analogy of drinking from a fire hose, right? There's so much information coming at us, and we're trying to make sense of it and make sure our science is solid, and our practices and everything are transparent to make sure that there's more confidence in this industry.
Great. Thanks a lot, John. It's interesting that you mentioned there about being interested in the final product of something that comes from a farm or ranch. And today we're chatting about another type of final product, not necessarily something you can hold in your hand, but something else that could come out of farming and ranching. John, you mentioned you're from the Midwest. Mark, you are as well?
Yeah. So I born and raised here in Central Ohio, Richland County, and reside here today. And we farm in Richland County, as well as a couple other counties to the south of us here, where we get to practice kind of playing with the practices that we implement here today. So we're very passionate about no-till and cover crops, and get to experience it firsthand on our acres.
Great. Thanks for sharing. So today we're talking about verifying a carbon project. Broadly speaking, carbon projects produce carbon credits. Carbon credits represent a metric ton of CO2 that's either sequestered or reduced from the baseline scenario, which is sort of the business as usual scenario. Carbon projects need to prove that their practices are actually sequestering the carbon that they say they are, so they have a third-party auditor assess a project's claims and assumptions. They don't only assess that, but they assess a project's conformity to the rules and requirements set out by the methodology that they're using and standard that they're holding their project to, as well as different local laws and regulations to make sure everything's on the up and up. So I got a question back to you, Mark. Seeing that you're out in the field talking to farmers and ranchers alike, and are a farmer yourself, can you tell us about some practices that lead to carbon sequestration on the farming side of things? And I think you already did touch upon this a little bit in your introduction.
Yeah, so what we're looking at is reduction in tillage, or even getting to zero tillage whatsoever, soil disturbance. And the thought process there that I like to talk to farmers about to kind of bring that into perspective is you look at soil on the landscape, and there was an agronomist, I guess, back up in Kansas that worded it very well to me years ago, and he said, where on the planet do you see disturbed soil outside of agriculture? Or where do you see soil, on the landscape that has nothing growing in it whatsoever? And I guess we'll talk about that with cover crops later. But as far as the disturbance part, I really couldn't come to any understanding of any soil situation where we're seeing annual disturbance like we do in agriculture. And when you start looking at the life that we actually have in our soil, the microbial activity, the fungal activity that should be present in those soils, they've evolved over the years to survive in that undisturbed manner. So tillage was used historically for loosening the soil, weed management, so on and so forth, when we didn't really have some of the other chemical mechanisms that we have today to manage those things. But really, the microbial activity is what's really suffered over the years with all of this disturbance in the soil. And over time, it's led to the loss of organic matter and soil structure, and the loss of carbon in the soil. So when we stop tilling, we give that microbial activity the opportunity to pick up and start accumulating again, and in return build soil carbon. So you take that a step further with cover crops, and that's the point I made a few minutes ago about the agronomist saying, where on the planet do you see soil bare with nothing growing in it? And I could really only think of frigid environments where it's just physically too cold for too long of the year for vegetation to perform photosynthesis. Maybe sand environments like deserts. But other than that, if you look across the landscape, there's usually something growing at all times in all soils. So that was kind of an aha moment for me when he told me that, was, we really shouldn't be disturbing our soils, and we really should be trying to have a living root in that ground at all time to facilitate this. There's a coexistence between this microbial activity and plant life. Plants are breathing in carbon dioxide, excreting some of that carbon through their roots into the soil. These microbial activity is consuming that carbon and mineralizing it and creating permanence. And by reducing tillage or getting rid of your tillage and trying to keep something living in that soil at all time, we can best mimic what happens in those natural landscapes. So that's what we're trying to do on our farm, and what we encourage farmers to do is really just minimize disturbance and have as much growing in the soil at all time, create as much biomass as you possibly can, and in result will increase organic matter and increase soil carbon.
That's fascinating, Mark. Thanks a whole lot for sharing that. So it sounds like there's a whole host of scientifically proven methods here to sequester carbon, and there's a lot to it. So what I'd like to know now is, how do we know this is working? These practices, cover cropping, no tillage, reduced tillage, are working on a farm, and how do we know this is working on a field by field basis, farmer by farmer basis? Seeing that, chatted earlier about verification, producing carbon credits, is very much, in using a third-party auditor, is very much so proving that these methods are doing what they say they're doing. So, John, would you mind telling us how we collect this data? How do we show an auditor from a soil science perspective that this is truly happening? What does Agoro go out and do, and then what do we show an auditor on a science-based perspective here?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I think ultimately, there's a lot of trust that needs to come from this industry. And so Mark's team does a really great job of, working with the farmers hand in hand to make sure that they're implementing these practices, that we have proof that they're implementing these practices. But ultimately, the next step for us is to do the soil sampling that actually shows the, tangible benefits for carbon. The grower might be seeing benefits all along of, like Mark said, or increased organic matter, increased water retention, and other aspects that they're seeing benefits from these practices on their farm. But, because we are asked to quantify the carbon that's being sequestered or stored in the soil, that's really where the soil sampling aspect really kicks in. And so, that can sometimes seem as a normal or easy process if we think of it in the same realm as normal fertility sampling. But I'd say it's a little bit more complicated when we look at carbon sampling, because a lot of what we do is trying to measure the entire impact across the entire farm. And so we have a data team within Agoro Carbon that does a really great job of laying out a sampling design to account for the differences in the landscape, the differences in the field by field and area by area, to really use that precision to determine how areas are combined or viewed as strata. And then from there, we're having third-party soil samplers go out and collect samples for us. And again, that's really the idea behind that, is that we're, providing this transparent, very scientifically based proof for the carbon that's growing in the soil, that's being accumulated in the soil. And then really, that's further proof to, one, for the farmer themselves, because I think sometimes there's questions or, uncertainty about exactly how this is working or how this is measured. So on the first part, we're providing this information back to the farmer so that they can understand that growth of carbon in their soil. And then also, like for this whole verification process as well, we're providing the proof, the impacts of these practices back to, third-party auditors and others, so that they can see, how these practices are both implemented, but also the impacts of those practices. So that's really, again, we're trying to use the most scientific and up-to-date methods and technologies out there to make sure that we're accounting for these differences, that we are confident in these results, and are able to defend them against anybody that might not understand it or might be skeptical of the market.
Fascinating. So it is rooted in a whole lot more than just a hunch, a whole lot more than just "you'll have to trust me." You mentioned carbon accrual, John. So if you're an enrolled farmer or rancher in our program, or any carbon program for that matter, when can you expect to have soil samples done? How would an auditor know what the baseline scenario looks like? And not just an auditor, but how would a farmer or rancher know what's below their soil before you told them?
Yeah, great question. So typically we work on a minimum of 3 times during the 10-year contract that the sampler can, or that a grower can expect to be sampled. So the first time is what we call the baseline sampling, where we really are trying to grasp where the growers' soil carbon levels are, before they adopt practices, before the impacts of their practices have really taken effect. Again, that's to create, kind of the status quo or where their soil levels are to begin with. That really gives us a launching pad to understand how these practices are changing carbon down the line. So again, we usually come back in year 5 and year 10 and do a resampling to understand how those levels have changed. But again, that's understanding that along this way, it's not a linear path that carbon grows on. So we might see some impact at year 5 and maybe the full effects by year 10. But the idea is that we're monitoring this and working with the other teams within Agoro Carbon to make sure that we're accounting and understanding why carbon is building in certain soils and why it might be building higher in certain soils versus other soils. And then, going back to the growers with Mark's team just does a great job of, relaying that information of what part of the implementation might be working better on certain farms versus others, but also that, own internal research that we do to understand best practices for these operations to generate carbon credits.
Great, thanks, John. So what I'm hearing is it takes a village, as they say. You mentioning Mark's team here. Mark, could you give a little insight about what team you're on, what your team does, one, and two, what sort of data would you collect? So John's chatting about collecting baseline data and actual practice implementation data in the form of soil samples, right? To have a look at what's going on below the surface and look at carbon accrual. Could you touch upon what your team is and what sort of data they collect to show practice change?
Yeah, sure. So I am the kind of the lead of the grower success support team. So myself and the other agronomists that work under my group work with our growers throughout the 10-year contract. And that is something that we as a company identified early on as a differentiator that we could provide to the customer as a form of support. So we identified that this is somewhat of a new idea, a new opportunity for these growers, and we wanted to walk with them throughout this contract instead of just offering them this, signing them up, and then hoping that they can facilitate it and navigate it themselves. So our goal is to work with them throughout the 10-year contract and kind of be that resource to them, both agronomically, but also with any questions they might have about the carbon market and the industry that we're working in. So as far as the data side, there's two different teams on this the GST team, what we would call the onboarding team and the support team. So when a customer signs in with a program, they're going to hear from a onboarding specialist who's going to work with them on generating their boundaries and establishing their acres and going through what we call the historical period. And we're going to collect 3 years of data at a field level on the row crop side, where we're looking at what practices were done on those acres throughout that 3-year period. So we're looking for crop types, planting dates, harvest dates, yields, any tillage that took place, anything of that sort, where we can use that data to establish the baseline that was taking place prior to implementing the practice. After we have that grower will then pass into what we call the support team, which is the team that I manage, and we are going to work with that grower throughout the 10 years in which they are in contract with us. And at that time, we're going to collect basically the same data that we did for the historical period, but with the implementation rather, that they are signed up for. So if they're signed up for cover crops, we're obviously going to need what species they're planting, when they're planting it, when are they terminating it, how are they terminating it, things of that nature, so we can establish the change that is taking place on that acre throughout the contracted period. So we're really there to help facilitate that process, try to make it as seamless as possible. And like John said, him and I have been here since the beginning, and we've seen our company really evolve and establish some good tools to make that process easier. And we're continuing to evaluate and evolve and try to make our program as user-friendly as possible. So we've come a long way in 3.5 years, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the years to come ahead of us.
Great. And you mentioned you've been here from the beginning, and I gotta tell our listeners, I first had the pleasure of meeting these two gentlemen out in the field on a site visit, actually, out in the Pacific Northwest. And so this is not their first rodeo when it comes to going through an audit like this. Can I ask either one of you some of your musings on that audit? What if somebody going through a carbon project audit where they're having auditors come look at the fields, talk to farmers, talk to growers, also talk to us looking for data and evidence? What were some of the questions that they asked, and can you give us a high level? What was that all about? What can somebody involved in a carbon project expect from something like this?
Yeah, I guess I can kick off some answers there. The audit that I was a part of in the PNW, there was kind of a couple different steps in each audit. So there was kind of a question and answer together with the auditor, but then as well, kind of an independent session between the auditor and the grower. And they were asking us for questions as far as what are some questions maybe that growers are asking you, or how much involvement do you have with your growers? How often do you hear from them? And it's a realm, so there are some that rely on us heavily for questions and resources, and there's others that are maybe a little more confident in their implementation that we don't hear from quite as often. But all in all, they definitely see us as a resource, and it seems to me that a lot of the feedback we've had from the auditing parties is that what we offer from a support side of our business is somewhat unique and has some really high value. So yeah, it's been a good experience to be part of these audits, to kind of see how we can differentiate and how that can be valued, both from a customer standpoint, where we're offering value to them as far as how to best implement their practices, what can they do better, what can they do differently, but also how our offering from a support standpoint is different from other projects, and how that can offer value to our buyers as well. How they can see that we're invested in the success of our customers, and we're putting people in place to push that across the finish line, so to speak. So I think it's two-sided. It shows good value to our customers, but it also shows good value to our buyers of credits as well.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Mark. From the outside looking in, this may seem like a lot of work. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't. We're holding our project to the highest standard available, as we owe it to our enrolled farmers and ranchers to ensure that we are doing all we can to have them be a part of a high-quality carbon project. There are a lot of carbon projects out there making a lot of claims. Carbon credit buyers want to know their investments are being taken seriously and that their dollars spent are directly benefiting farmers and ranchers here in the United States, and they're making a tangible difference for farmers and ranchers in the environment. Not only is the carbon sequestration numbers being audited, the actual practice implementation, but the actual efficacy. What else are these practices doing? What sort of co-benefits? That's the word that is being thrown around a lot these days. What sort of co-benefits are we getting from these projects? And that's another thing that's assessed, broadly speaking, by these auditors that we were chatting about. So can I ask you folks, Mark or John, what other benefits are auditors testing the efficacy of? Carbon sequestration, while important, isn't the full story. So what sort of co-benefits could you get out of reduced tillage, cover cropping, or any of the other options that we have for our range and pasture project?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it kind of comes back to something I talked about in the beginning of the podcast here, and there's an observation that takes place from these growers that maybe have been doing this. I've had the privilege of meeting people that have adopted no-till as far back as the 70s, and the benefits that they talk about, the changes they have talked about in their soil, is what kind of captivated me to be interested in it and to understand its benefits, and kind of landed me where I am today working in these markets. So for me, it's about the soil and what it does to the soil. And when I was talking earlier about incorporation and disturbance, what we really lose, and one of the main aspects that we lose, is the structure of the soil. And when you lose that structure, you lose your water holding capacity, your ability for water to percolate through the soil, your ability for the soil to bind to itself and hold and not erode. And the longer you do these things, the more you see the benefits that I'm talking about take place. I mean, organic matter accumulation and carbon accumulation take a long time, and so do healing the soils to the states that they were before we started disturbing them. So it's a long game. It is not something that happens overnight, but when you start seeing these mechanisms working, it's really exciting. So for me, water is a really good way to gauge kind of the change. And some of the things you'll see as you implement no-till cover crops, reducing your tillage, is you'll see your water holding capacity start to increase. A good metric of this is a lot of times here in central Ohio and in the Corn Belt in general, we'll have substantial or fairly ample soil, or moisture rather, and moisture going through the spring and early summer. And then as we get into those late July and August months, we start to see that moisture start to kind of taper off, and then our temperatures are climbing through the latter parts of the summer. So one of the big indicators of where you're at with soil moisture is what your corn crop look like. And it's not uncommon to see a corn crop under extreme stress late in the year, extreme heat, start to curl leaves. And I've seen scenarios where you're looking at farms that have been no-tilled for decades, and might have a field right next to it that has intensive tillage, and that corn crop in the no-till field won't be curled as hard or may not be curled at all compared to the crop right next to it that is still being conventionally farmed with lots of tillage. So, and that right there attributes to crop health and yield, and then in turn, economic benefit. So now that's one indicator I think about with water, and the other one is I love looking at drain tile. You'll look at we here at our farm just this past weekend experienced between 5 and 6 inches of rain, and a lot of this soil here at my house has never seen any tillage, and it was a hay field before I bought it 2 or 3 years ago, so it's never been worked in decades. And the water coming out of that drain tile is perfectly clear, so we're not losing the silt and soil through erosion and water erosion because it has the aspects that are still there to hold that and bind that soil together. So yeah, there's many indicators to look at there. Those are a couple of my favorites, and the farmers that have been doing it for a long time, and the ones even that are implementing our program, when they over several years start to see some of these change and see their comparisons to their neighbors that maybe aren't doing the practice, that's when it gets exciting because they start to see the benefits kind of take shape, visually.
A lot of what Mark says rings really true to us too in Michigan, right? Like the traditional period that we're now seeing in late July or mid August of droughty periods, nothing as severe as the West, but still we're seeing periods where soybeans are getting up and growing and then just kind of standing still for a month or so. And so you do see those visual differences between some reduced tillage or no-till fields versus conventional, which are really cool. And again, it's partially the water, it's partially the soil structure that Mark talked about. But I would say as we get to travel, Mark and I get to travel quite a bit across the country. It's really cool to see the co-benefits that are different in different regions and on different farms. For one grower, it might be a compaction issue that really some of these practices cause a big impact or a positive influence on. On others, it might be water. On others, it might be weed control, so it's really cool to see those co-benefits, kind of, range the gamut versus if Mark and I were just staying where we are, we would see some co-benefits, near us, but to be able to go across the country and see the differences across the landscapes, I think that's really cool and kind of provides a larger picture for what these practices, how they have a good fit in a lot of areas and the different growers that are trying to make them work and the ingenuity that they're using to make them fit on their farms.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Another one that comes to mind, like John said, looking at other geographies, is we have a lot of business up in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of row crop acres out there where it's very, very dry, and historically those acres would be kept fallow. It's a wheat fallow rotation or a crop fallow rotation, and they'd be doing a lot of tillage in the fallow years to try to keep weeds at bay. Well, as technology on these sprayers continues to become more and more advanced, we have customers that are going away from tillage altogether, going to a chem fallow system, but even more so, they're using maybe a see and spray system where they're only spraying a weed that exists. So they're using very, very little chemical to stay fallow, and they're cutting all their tillage out. So you're seeing technology and things work together here, where people are becoming very efficient and having a lot of benefits, and becoming a lot more efficient and it's good for their bottom line. So it's exciting to see how all these things kind of work together to better the farmer.
And I'm sure Mark can speak to this too, but I think a lot of times when some of these practices are talked about, they use the word sustainability, but, a lot of times when you talk to growers, that sustainability has to be economic as well. And so a lot of what Mark said, they're not just doing these practices, in a sense to reduce their inputs or reduce aspects of their workload, but a lot of it is, it impacts their bottom line in a positive way. And so again, that's really where, finding the way that these practices can be implemented on each individual farm, that's really where the grower really takes the lead and tries to think of the ways in which they can implement these practices and have them work for their bottom line sustainability as well.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time here, and thanks so much for providing a lot more insight into what goes into a carbon project. And that's a wrap. Thanks for joining Agoro Carbon Alliance's Ag Carbon podcast. Want to hear more about regenerative agriculture, carbon markets, and more? Head on over to Agoro Carbon Alliance's Knowledge Hub on agorocarbonalliance.com.